Well, I'm glad that you're here this morning. Now, what we're going to do in this session before lunch is I'm going to introduce you to a 12-step method of sermon preparation. We'll use as best I can anyway. We're going to use the PowerPoint. But one of the handouts that you have is a listing of these 12 steps. If you want to take a look at that in front of you, 12 steps in sermon preparation. Now, this method is a method that I have used in my own preaching for 35 years. And not only that, I have taught preaching for 35 years. So I've used this method, and I know that it works. And I want to introduce it to you because I believe that it will help you in your preparation of sermons. Now, there are different ways to write a sermon. We all know that. We all understand that. So there are many ways to skin the cat, if you've heard the saying. But this is a method that I know works and works very well for genuine biblical preaching. So let me just walk you through the 12 steps of sermon preparation. Step number 1 is pray. Before you can do anything else in your preaching, you must pray. Because preaching is a spiritual event. Preaching is something that is more than man-centered, something that's more than a human being preaching, speaking to other human beings. It is that, but it is more. If you are to preach well, you must have the power of God upon your preaching. You must have, the old word that we used to use was the unction of the Holy Spirit, the filling of the Holy Spirit. And so step number 1, before you do anything else in sermon preparation, is pray. Number 1, you need divine power. You need God's power. Number 2, you need divine guidance. And number 3, you need divine wisdom. You need all of these. You need God's power. You need His guidance as you prepare that sermon. And you need His wisdom. What to say, how to say it, how to communicate this in a way that the people are going to understand. And so step number 1 is prayer. You've got to walk with God in prayer. By the way, the secret, the key to the Christian life is your daily walk with God. And the key to good preaching is a daily walk with God. Just recently, I know you've seen on the news, one of the well-known preachers in the Dallas area who has conference ministry all over, and he's in his early 70s, married, of course, has children, grandchildren, but he has had to step down from all of his ministry assignments because of a sinful relationship with another woman. And this, of course, we are continually hearing about these things, and seems like every week somewhere somebody is involved in that kind of thing. Now, there's only one way that can happen, and that is when you're not walking with God. There's only one way to overcome these temptations that are common to all people, and that is a daily walk with God. And so your daily walk with God in many ways is the foundation of everything you do in ministry. Remember what Paul said to Timothy, take heed to yourself and to your ministry. You've got to first take heed to your own spiritual life and then to your ministry. So when it comes to preaching, you've got to pray. So you need divine power, guidance, and wisdom. So prayer is so important in what we are doing in preaching. Number 2 is read the text. Step number 2, read your text over several times in English. Well, obviously it'd be in English because we're speaking or preaching in English. Sometimes I've taught these conferences overseas through a translator, and it might be Korean or Japanese or some other language. But step number 2 is you want to read your text over several times before you even begin writing your sermon. Now, if you have had the biblical languages, if you've studied Greek or Hebrew, then you can use those, do a little rough translation at this point. Don't spend a lot of time with that. If you haven't had Greek or Hebrew, don't worry about it. Then just work with the English Bible. All right? So read that text over several times in English. Now, there are several reasons for doing that. And so, for example, here's the text that I want us to use as a guinea pig text. This is the text I will preach on this afternoon. So we're going to use Hebrews 12, 1 through 3. So let's pretend that it's Monday morning. It's Monday morning, and next Sunday, this is your text. The next Sunday, this is your text right here, okay? So what you would do is you will read over this text several times before you write one word of your sermon. Now, why would you do that? Why would that be important? Well, there are several reasons why that you would do that. Number one, it helps you to familiarize yourself with the text. You become familiar with it. The more you read it over and over, the more you familiarize yourself with the text. And number two, by doing that, you can analyze briefly the text. You can analyze briefly what appears to be the overall structure of the text. And so you can jot down a few notes there. You familiarize yourself, analyze briefly your text. And number three, memorize it if possible. Now, if it's a shorter text, you might be able to memorize it because you're going to read it over several times in English, reading it over several times each day, starting Monday morning prior to your preaching it the next Sunday. And if it's a short enough text, maybe 2, maybe 3 verses, you might be able to memorize it. If it's a little bit of a longer text, you probably won't memorize it, but nevertheless, you will familiarize yourself with what is there. So read this text over several times in English would be, I think, a very important thing, a way to prepare to do your preaching. Familiarize yourself with it, analyze briefly the overall structure, and memorize it if possible. All right? So, okay, that jumped too far. Let's go back to number 3. Step number 3. What you're going to do, I'm probably just going to need a microphone because this is not going to stay on my ear. And so if we want to just get me a mic, maybe we'll just do that.
Can it go over your ear?
Well, I thought I had it over, but sure, try it one more time. If it'll stay, that feels fine. As long, yeah, you maybe that wire might be pulling. Maybe if I pull that over back like that. There we go. If that doesn't work, I'll just use a mic, but hopefully that'll work. Okay. All right. So observation. Here's what you do. You take your Bible and a pen or a pencil and a legal pad or notepad or your iPod or iPad or your computer, and you are going to read your text and observe what's there. What is in my text? What do I see? Now, during this step, nothing is off limits. Nothing is too trivial. Nothing is too unimportant. Anything you see in your text, you want to make notes about what you observe in the text. Notes about what you observe concerning people. Are there any people in your text? Are there any places in your text? If this is a story, is there any plot? What's the plot? Well, there will be a plot if it's a story. What is the plot? Is there a purpose statement in this text? Is there a statement of why the author is writing? Are there any repetitions? Are there any words that are repeated? Phrases that are repeated? What about, is there any doctrine that's taught here? If it's a story, is there dialogue? And if so, who says what to whom? These are the kinds of things, the notes that you want to make. Now, notice at this step, here we are, step number 3 of the 12 steps. How many commentaries have we looked at? 0, because you don't start with the commentaries. This is a common mistake that many preachers make. Don't start with the commentaries. We'll get to the commentaries in step number 6. But right now, I want you to just observe what you see in your text. Now, I can't remember if it's backwards or forwards here. Yeah, let's go back to the previous one here. I just want to go back to the text, if I can get back to it. Yeah, there it is. Did you do that up there? Did you move it for me? Okay, I may just let you, I may just tell you when to move it, and we can kind of go from there. You want me just to use that because it's still just flopping around here? I don't know why it's doing that, but we'll just think this through Sunday morning because I don't want to use the mic Sunday morning because I use my hands for other things in preaching here tomorrow. So we'll figure out, maybe it needs to be on the other ear. Maybe that's all we need. No, I'll just hold it. It's okay. Yeah, I'll just hold it. Don't worry about it. Don't need that. Thank you very much. We'll get it going. We'll figure out the mic, that part of it tomorrow. All right, so we're going to make notes. Okay, now, so here's your text. Do it with me right now. Quickly. Just look at that text and tell me anything you see that would be written down on your notes. What do you see there that you might write down? What would it be? Anything that jumps out at you. Anything unusual or anything, no matter how small of a detail is. What is in your text that you're probably going to want to look at in preparation for your sermon? Yes. Yeah, there's a connecting word to the previous context. So I'm going to write that down. What is that therefore referring to? Connecting to chapter 11. What's the relationship of chapter 11 to 12, 1, 2 through 3? I'm going to make a note of that. What else? What do you see? Observe it. What do you see? Okay, back here. Yeah. Yeah. That's what you would do. You would write down, that comes later. I'm going to explain what that is. But here you would say, now here's an unusual phrase, cloud of witnesses. I need to know, what does that mean? What's that referring to? So you write that down. Okay, what else? Right now we're just talking, what do you write down? Yeah, there's a word there that is the word every encumbrance in this particular translation. Now, somebody might not know what that word means, right? And so you're going to jot that down and say, you know what? I've got to look that word up to make sure I know what that word means. What else? Good. Popcorn. What do you see? Stuff you see you're going to write down. You got one command in this text. Notice he says, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. That is a command. So I'm going to make a note of that. What else? Yeah, the word race, the author is using the long-distance race as what? A metaphor for what? The Christian life, right? So I'm going to make a note of that. I'm going to write that down, all right? What else do you see? Is there any word that's repeated in each of those verses? Is there any repetition? What is it? What word is repeated in every verse? The word is endure. Look at verse 1. Run with endurance the race. Look at verse 2. Jesus who endured the cross. Look at verse 3. For consider him who endured such hostility. The author is repeating that word. That probably means this is an important word for him. So I'm going to make a note of that. The word endurance occurs 3 times. What else? Anything else you're going to make note of? Again, this is the stage where you just observe what's in the text. Observe it. Yes, sir. Right. There's a statement in there that says we are to run the race fixing or keeping our eyes on Jesus. Right? I'm going to jot that down. What else? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, because right. Yeah, encumbrance, we'll lay aside every weight. The word encumbrance here, has many translations, is the word weight. And the sin, did anybody catch this? The sin, notice the word is singular and not plural. I'm going to jot that down. Now, that's interesting. What does the author mean? The sin that easily entangles us. All right, now, you see my point. You see what we're doing here. Step number 3 is the step of observation. That's what we're doing. All you do right here is observe. Okay, now let's advance the slide here, and we'll get back on track here. Keep going to number 3. Notice we're going to make notes about anything and everything you observe in the text. Observation. All right, now let's review the first 3. Number 1, you're going to pray. And by the way, from start to finish and everything in between, you're going to pray. All right, number 1 is you're going to pray. Number 2, you're going to read that text over several times. Read it over. Familiarize yourself with it. Number 3, you're going to make observations of what you see in the text. Listen, it's amazing what you will see in a text of Scripture if you will just look. Just take the time to look, observe. All right? Now, we're ready to go to step number 4. And step number 4 is what I call investigation. And what I mean by this step is investigation of the background of the text. All right? Now, let's pause here for a minute and let's pretend that in 4 weeks you are going to begin a series of sermons through a book of the Bible. Now let's choose 1 John. So 4 weeks from now, you're starting a series through 1 John. All right, you with me? So what you want to do before you write sermon number 1 for that series, you want to do this step right here. You want to study the background of your book, right? Now there are 6 things that you are studying when it comes to the background of a book of the Bible. Number 1 is authorship. Who wrote it? All right, with 1 John, who wrote it? John the Apostle. All right, so you want to learn everything you can about John the Apostle. What do you know about him? He was a fisherman. He's the son of Zebedee, had a brother named James. He wrote 5 books in the New Testament. The Gospel of John, 3 letters, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. He was the only apostle who did not die a martyr's death. All of the other 11 were martyred. John was the apostle who did not die a martyr's death. What else do you know about him? He was, for a period of time, pastor of the church at Ephesus. So I'm going to, again, when I do my background study before I preach a book, I'm going to look at the authorship. So if I'm preaching through 1 John, I'm going to learn some things about authorship. Then I'm going to look at date. When was this book written? That's going to be important. So I look for date. I study about the date. When was it written? Number 3, to whom was it written? Who are the recipients? That's an important question to ask. And so you ask that question and you do the research. And by the way, you can use introductions to commentaries to get this information. Or there are books called Introduction of the Old Testament, Introduction of the New Testament, and they just go book by book, Genesis to Revelation, giving you these 6 pieces of information. So you can find this information a lot of different places, but we're going to look at recipients, right? Then number 4, the theme of a book. What's it about? Is there a key theme? Number 5, does the author state why he wrote it? In 1 John, there are 4 statements of purpose, 2 at the beginning and 2 at the end. John says, I'm writing that we may have fellowship with one another and with the Father. I'm writing that your joy, that we may have joy full joy. Later in the book, he says, I'm writing that you may know that you have eternal life. And finally, he says, I'm writing that you may know truth from error. So John overtly gives 4 reasons why he's writing. That's important to know. And then finally, what's the outline of the book? How's the book structured? So you'd want to look at the outline. Now, let me show you why this step is important for beginning to preach through a book, or how important it is also if you're already in a book and as you move through paragraph by paragraph, is there any background information? Let's start with 1 John. Have you ever noticed that 1 John begins in a strange way? It doesn't begin like other letters. 1 John begins like this: that which we have seen, that which we have heard, that which our hands have handled concerning the word of life. That which then he repeats it, we've seen, we've heard, we declare unto you. Now, what in the world is going on there? The key to understanding that is this step right here. Because when you study the background of 1 John, you will discover that toward the end of the first century, which is the date 1 John was written, probably in the decade of the 90s and of the first century, and John was an octogenarian by the time he wrote. He was in his 80s. And there was a philosophy, a new growing philosophy that was infiltrating Asia Minor, which is where the churches were that John is writing his letter of 1 John. That philosophy was called Gnosticism. And Gnosticism was based on a couple of things. Number one, it taught spirit is good, but matter is evil. And therefore, matter and spirit never connect or never meet. So the goal in life is to leave the physical world and somehow make it to the spiritual world. Are you with me? Now, I want you to think about that for just a minute. If that were true, it's false, but if it were true, what does that do to the incarnation of Jesus? It makes it impossible for Jesus to be fully man. You see that? And the Gnostics taught just that. Jesus was not a man. He only appeared to be a man. But if you walked up to him and reached out to shake his hand, your arm would go through his body because he doesn't have a physical body. He's more of a ghost or a spirit. He appears to be real, but he is not. Do you see that? Now, with that knowledge in mind, go back and read 1 John 1 through 4. That which we have seen, that which we have heard, which our hands have handled, concerning the word of life. That's John's metaphor for Jesus. So what is John doing? First rattle out of the box, he is taking a sword and stabbing Gnosticism as a false doctrine. Now, you see, you will not be able to help your people understand why John uses all of that those tactile words, see, hear, touch, in 1 John 1 through 4, unless you know the background of the book that John was writing to churches where this philosophy was infiltrating the churches and creating false doctrine. That's why this step is important. Now, there's an example of why this step is important for your understanding of 1 John. Remember what John says later in chapter 4 of 1 John. Any spirit that does not confess that Jesus has come in the flesh is Antichrist. Now, why would John say that? Again, he's combating Gnosticism, because Gnosticism taught Jesus didn't come in the flesh. He was only a spirit being. Are you with me now? That's why this step is important. Now, That's if you're getting ready to preach through a book of the Bible, you want to spend a lot of time looking at all the background data, getting that down on paper. All right? Now let's go back to our preaching through this one text of Hebrews 12, 1 through 3. All right? Look at that text, and what is something that relates to background? What do you need to know the background of here in order to adequately preach this text? And the answer is the meaning of the word race. What is John talking about when he says, run the race, right, with endurance? Let us run with endurance. John is using a common event in the first century, the Olympic Games. And everybody knew about them then, just like everybody knows about them now. And the Olympic Games were held every so many years, and they were well known in the Greek world. And one of the events in the Olympic Games, just like it is today, was the long distance race. And so what you would want to know is, what is the background of that race? Well, you might learn that there were 3 or 4 different games. The Olympic Games were one. The Isthmian Games were held down in Corinth and some other places. And you would discover, when you begin to look at the background here, that these were very popular, and professional runners, professional athletes had their following just like people today. You know, if you're a tennis fan, you've got a favorite tennis athlete. If you're a football fan, you've got a favorite team or a favorite player. And you're a baseball fan, you know, you've got a favorite team or a favorite player, right? Well, that was true then just like it is today. And so these famous runners, long-distance runners, were well known. And many times when the Olympic Games or the other games would occur, people would take a week off of their work, and they would travel down to Corinth or over to Athens or wherever and watch their favorite runner, you know. So this is the background. Knowing that what the author of Hebrews means by the race, he's talking about a long-distance race. Okay? So that's the basic background. You really don't need much else, but you do need to know that. So this step right here, step number 4, the investigation of the background of a text, is very, very important. All right? So now we've done 4. We've got 4 of the 12 under our belt. Pray. Read that text over several times. Observe. Make notes of what you see in the text. And then study the background of the text. Investigation. Let's go to step number 5. Step number 5 is interpretation. Now, this is where you're going to spend a lot of time, because this is where you are going to utilize resources, and you're going to look at your text. You're going to study the structure of the text. You're going to determine what is the structure. You're going to look into, if you've had Greek, you're going to look at Greek. If you haven't had Greek, you're going to probably look at what commentaries may be saying about the text at this point, or other resources. You'll be doing word studies during this time. So this is the lengthy part of the job. Now, pardon me, let me say that I'm going to, in just a minute, we're going to fast forward through about 10 of these because there's so many details here. By the way, for me to teach these 12 steps, this is an entire semester worth of material that I teach in my classes when I teach preaching. We've got 1 hour, and then we've got lunch, and then I'm going to preach. And so we're not going to go into all of the details. But step number 5, this is where you're going. Let me tell you what you're going to do in this step. You're going to start at the paragraph level, and you're going to look at the big picture of the structure, the big picture. Then you're going to work your way down to the sentence level, and you will identify the number of sentences in the paragraph. Then you're going to come to the clause level, and you will determine how many clauses are there, And remember your basic English grammar. How many clauses are there in basic English grammar? How many? 2. What are they? Number 1 is independent. And what's the other one? Dependent. Right, there you go. All clauses in grammar, and this is true for English and for Greek. This New Testament was written in Greek, so there's a parallel match here. All clauses are either independent or dependent. Now let's define them, make sure we refresh our memory a minute. Number 1, what is an independent clause? It is a clause that can grammatically stand alone, and therefore it is a sentence. It might be short or long, but it can stand alone. Therefore, it's called an independent clause. What is a dependent clause? It's a supporting clause that cannot stand alone. So it is modifying something else. Now, there are 2. This is crucial. If I can teach you this and nothing else, I've improved your preaching 50%. Go through your text and identify the independent clauses and the dependent clauses. And in which of those 2 is the author going to convey his main, most important information? Independent clauses. And then the subordinate clauses are going to be modifying, right? Either independent clauses or other subordinate clauses, right? And therefore, we're going to be able to determine the structure this way. Now, again, don't worry about this 1 to 5. I don't want you to worry about that. Just go on to the next slide, and it's going to be 6 through 10, but I don't want you to worry about that. But I just want you to see, right? Now go on to the next slide, okay? Now, here's what we're going to do. We're going to now go through and look at the clauses because I've placed them here for you. This is what you need to do. You say, now, David, I don't do this when I'm writing my sermon. Well, I want to teach you how to do this because this is how you're going to do biblical preaching, text-driven preaching. The text is king. The structure of the text becomes the outline structure of the sermon. That's expository preaching. All right? So just stay with me. I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, here, this is what we call a block diagram of this text. Now, I want you to look at it carefully. Notice that there are indentations here. What you do in a block diagram is you take the independent clauses and you place them to the far left. And then the dependent clauses you indent to the right and place them under the clause they modify. Are you with me? All right, now let's just take a look at it. There is one independent clause in this text, and it is, therefore let us run with endurance the race set before us. Every other clause in these 2 verses of Hebrews 12, 1 and 2 is dependent. There's only one independent clause. All right? And therefore I place it first. It doesn't come first in order, but I place it first for you to see. Therefore, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. That is your independent clause. Okay? Now, look at the 3 clauses underneath. All 3 of those clauses begin with a participle. By definition, in English grammar, a participial clause is a dependent clause. It cannot stand alone. Most participial clauses end, the first word ends with an ing. Right? So take a look here. Having a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us. Now let me ask you, is that an independent sentence or is that a dependent clause? That's a dependent clause. It cannot stand alone. Look at the next one. Laying aside every weight and the sin that entangles us. Is that an independent clause or a dependent clause? It is dependent. Look at the third one. looking unto Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. Is that an independent clause or a dependent clause? It is dependent. Now look at what you've just done. Now look, how many commentaries have we looked at? Not any yet. But what you have done in your study of the structure of your text, you have identified the sentences and the clauses. There's one independent clause. Therefore, let us run with endurance the race set before us. Then there are 3 parallel subordinate clauses, all participial clauses. And watch this. All 3 modify let us run. Read it this way, right? Having a great cloud of witnesses, let us run. Laying aside every weight, let us run. Looking unto Jesus, let us run. You see that? Now, notice that under the looking unto Jesus clause, there is a 4th clause. This clause is introduced by the relative pronoun who. Now, who or what is the antecedent of the word who? Jesus. So this is a further subordinate clause telling you more about who Jesus is and what he did. Are you with me? Notice it is subordinate to the 3rd subordinate clause. So here you have a subordinate clause modifying a subordinate clause. Do you see that? All right. Now, so who is this Jesus? Well, Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning the shame, despising is another translation, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. 3 things are said about who Jesus is and what he did. Jesus is the one who endured the cross, number 1. Jesus is the one who scorned, despised the shame of the cross, number 2. Jesus is the one who, when he arose from the dead, that's understood, he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God, number 3. So you have a relative clause, right? Relative clause modifying the previous participial clause. Now, that is the structure of Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. There's the structure right there. And so again, in this step, number 5, right, what we're doing is now we are doing all of the work of preparation, the data, all the meaning, and then we're going to later put it together in the sermon. Now, notice, have we written the sermon yet? No, it's too early. You can't write what you don't know. You can't write about what you don't know. So until you know the meaning and until you know the structure, then you can't write about it. Are you with me? Okay? So now, see, we're looking at the clausal level. So we started with a big paragraph. Then we went to the sentences, right? Then now we're doing the clauses, all right? And then we create this structure to help us see the clauses. Now that you've done clauses, you're ready to go down to the next level, which are the phrases. All right, so let's go to the next slide, and we move to the phrase level. Now you want to identify key phrases, especially the prepositional phrases, right? Determine their syntax, their proper translation. Okay, move to the phrase level. Next slide. So, how about if we identify some phrases? Here are 3. Cloud of witnesses, with endurance, and for the joy set before him. Notice those are 3 phrases in our text. So I'm going to make a note of that in my notes, right? And now I want to determine what do those phrases mean. The first phrase, cloud of witnesses. What in the world does that mean? Well, cloud here is being used as a metaphor so that if you look in the sky and you see a cloud, a large cloud, right? The author is using that metaphorically to talk about a large group of something. And the large group here happen to be people who are witnesses. Now, who are the witnesses? Who comprise the cloud of witnesses? Well, notice, therefore, connects our text with Hebrews chapter 11. What do you know about Hebrews 11? It's the great hall of fame of faith. By faith, Enoch. By faith, Noah. By faith, Abel. By faith, Abraham and Sarah. By faith, Moses. By faith, 17 times you get somebody's doing something by faith until you come to the last person on the list, by faith, Rahab. Okay? And then you come to verses 30, 39, and 40 of Hebrews chapter 11. And take a look at 39 and 40. Hebrews 11 and verses, the last two verses. Okay, take a look at it. And here's what you read. All these, verse 39, all these were approved through their faith, but they did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, so that they would not be made perfect without us. And your translation may say, all these bore witness through their faith. Now comes Hebrews 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, contextually, therefore, who are the witnesses? Chapter 11, the great men and women of faith of chapter 11. Right. Contextually, the witnesses are not grandpa, grandma, mom or dad who've gone on to heaven and they're in the grandstands watching. Whether people are in heaven, whether people who are in heaven, who are our family members, have access to what we're doing on the earth, the Bible doesn't say. They may and they may not. Scripture doesn't say. That's one of the most often asked questions I get, by the way. Every week almost, somebody asks me that question. And frankly, the Scripture doesn't say. But whether it's true or not true, it's not what this text means. Contextually, the great cloud of witnesses are the great men and women of faith who've gone before us. And they bear witness to us by their testimony that we can follow in their footsteps. We stand on their shoulders, right? So now we know what cloud of witnesses mean. Now let me show you something else. Let's go quickly a little bit deeper. All right, let me stretch you just a minute. What is the meaning of the word of in English? Can you define the word podium? Can you define the word book? Can you define the word cup? Can you define the word microphone? Of course you can. But do you notice how hard it is to define the word of? That's because in English language and in Greek, there are two kinds of words. You have content words, nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. But then you have function words, like of. And the word of in English is used in 6 different ways. So let me give you a couple of examples. If I say, the preaching of Jesus Christ, the preaching of Jesus Christ, what does the of mean in that sentence? Well, or in that clause, it can mean one of two things. It can mean the preaching which Jesus is doing. Jesus is the one preaching. Or, without any other context, it can mean you're preaching about Jesus. The word of in that one clause with no other context can mean either one of those. All right? Now let's keep going. What if I say the book of Roland? The book of Roland. What is the meaning of the word of in that phrase? Possession. Now there's a third. See, that's a third use of the word of. Possession. Now, what if we say the state of Colorado? Is that possession? No. Is Colorado doing something, or is something being done to Colorado? No. So all three of the previous meanings aren't there. This is a fourth use of the English word of, and it's functioning like an equal sign. Because in the phrase, the state of Colorado, state and Colorado are equivalent. The state being referred to is Colorado. Colorado is a state, and therefore there's like an equal sign. That's the meaning here. The cloud of witnesses means the same kind of thing as the state of Colorado. It's used here as an equal sign. The cloud is the witnesses. The witnesses are the cloud. Are you with me? All right. Now, I know you don't normally think about this when you're writing sermons, but you have to go through and identify the phrases. Then, in context, you've got to identify the meaning of those phrases, because you've got to know the meaning and their use in your text before you can write the sermon explaining what that means to your people. Are you see what I'm saying? So this is an important step. So now look where we've gone. Paragraph, and then where? Sentence, then where? Clause, identifying those, then where? Phrase. Okay, now do you have a question before we move on? Okay, now here we're going even more. Yeah, this is the example of how context is crucial. Because the word state in that phrase, the state of Colorado with no other context, our first thought is, okay, we're referring to the fact that Colorado is one of 50 states in America. But you could be reading, and somebody could be using, they may use the phrase, the state of Colorado, and they may be talking about whether it's blue or red in the upcoming election. Or economic, what's the economic state in Colorado? So the word state itself has multiple meanings. Do you see what that's a great question. That gives me the opportunity to further. It's just like that word run yesterday. How many uses are there, meanings, to the English word run? In an unabridged dictionary, more than 100. This is what we're getting at. So not only words, but phrases mean what they mean in context. Now, in the context of the passage, the cloud of witnesses is a reference to the great men and women of faith in Hebrews 11. The cloud equals the witness. The witnesses are the crowd. Everybody see that? Good. Yes, sir. That is what? Right. It's connecting something. That's right. Two things are being connected in the word of. Right. It's got to be connected to something. Right. Right. So just like the first phrase that I used, the preaching of Jesus. See, that phrase can mean, of there can mean about. It's you are preaching about Jesus. But that phrase can mean source. Jesus is the one doing the preaching. See, there's a difference between about and source. Of can be used in multiple ways. That's my point. Yes. I think that is correct. There are times when that may be true. Well, here it's context. The answer to that question is context. Because read cloud in terms of judgment and see if it makes sense in this text. No, it makes no sense. So it's not talking about judgment. The word cloud is being used metaphorically of a large group of people. And how do you know that? Context. No, because see, the author says we are to run our race being aware of the cloud of those who have gone before us and bear witness that the life of faith is the only life worth living. See, that's the context. So there's no judgment in the context. But that's a good question because that allows me to make the point. Things mean what they mean in context. So your job as you're preparing a sermon, you're preparing your text to preach, you've got to make sure that you have gotten the meaning correct contextually. You have to make sure of that. And that's why we're going through this. That's why we've not written the sermon yet. We're taking this step by step. Paragraph, sentence, clause, phrase. We're in the phrases now, looking at the meaning of the phrases. Now let's go forward. Now we're ready to go where? Where do we go next? After phrases. Uh-oh, it's not there. Yeah, there we go. Go to the word level. Now you're ready to do word studies of key words in your text. Now let's think about our text. What are some of the key words in our text? What would you say is one word in our text that's worthy of a word study? Yeah, endurance. I want to know, what does that word mean? Now, I know in English, I know basically what it means. In Greek, it's the word hupomone, and it means to bear under a heavy load without quitting. There's your endurance. To bear under a heavy load without quitting. So the opposite of endurance is to quit. That's why he says, run the race with endurance. What are your two options when you're in a marathon? Halfway through, or anywhere in between, start to finish, what are your two options when you're running a marathon? What's option one? Option one is what? Keep going. What's option two? Thank you very much. You can either keep going or you can quit, right? And so what is the author saying by this metaphor, or this word endurance? He's saying keep going. You don't quit on Jesus, no matter what. Keep going. So we're doing here, we are now looking at word studies. And here's where you use all the word study tools. You can use a commentary or any other word, lexicon, dictionary, Greek dictionary, or theological dictionary that tells you what these Greek words mean. And those would be good tools to have in your library, either digitally, use Blue Letter Bible or something, or use Logos or something, and you can look these up. Also, there are the books, the tools you need, like a lexicon. That means a dictionary. You need a concordance. You need maybe some theological dictionaries. Or if there's a book on word studies of keywords in the Bible, there are some of those on the market. Vine's Expository Dictionary of Word, New Testament words. I'd get a copy of that and use it. Also, though, what you want to do is you want to look at words that are not only repeated, but look at words that are used in the same semantic domain. All that means is they're synonyms. And look at words that are antonyms. Go to the next slide. I think it's up here. So notice words like endurance. Notice that it occurs 3 times. But notice in our text, there are words that are used that are the opposite of endurance. Notice what they are. Weights, sin. That S should be taken off there. That's my mistake. Sin, entangles, not grow weary, lose heart. 5 words or phrases that mean the opposite of what? Endurance. So now you're beginning to get the feel of your text. What's the author saying here? You see, remember our 3 steps are the 3 aspects of text-driven preaching. Stay true to what? Substance of the text, structure of the text, and what's number 3? Spirit of the text. What's the tone or feel, the spirit? The tone or feel of our text is endurance. It's an athletic text. You want to endure, and you don't want to let weights hold you down or sin, or you don't want to get entangled with those, and you don't want to grow weary, and you don't want to lose heart. Because if you grow weary and if you lose heart, what are you not going to do? You're not going to finish the race. You see how it all fits together. Now, again, I know I'm repeating this and probably driving you nuts doing it, but repetition is the key to learning. Okay? Start with a paragraph. Don't start down with the words. That's the mistake most preachers make. Monday morning, 8 a.m., they're getting their study, going to preach this text, pull it out, look at it, pull out a commentary. Ooh, there's a word I want to know. Let's do a word study on that word. No, you're already doing it backwards. Start with a big picture. What we're going to do first is aerial photography of the text at 10,000 feet. We're going to do aerial photography. Then, gradually, we're going to swoop down and do row by row crop dusting. 10 feet off the ground. I was driving last week to Memphis. I teach in Memphis, and all my classes are online, but I go up every 4 or 5 weeks and spend a week. I've got a little apartment in the student village there, my office there. And so I'm driving that road between Little Rock and Memphis, Tennessee. And it's it's the Delta type, it's very flat, just flat all the way, And there are, as far as you can see, on both sides of the road for 100 miles, 120 miles between Little Rock and Memphis are basically farmland, right? And so I watched a plane doing crop dusting. And I saw him, he's banking, he's coming around, and he's just right over there to my left, on the left side of the road, where all the field, hundreds of acres of something, and he just comes down looked to be about 10, 20 feet off the ground, and he releases that stuff, and he crop dusts, okay? So preaching, you start aerial photography at 10,000 feet, the big picture. Then you work your way down to the details to row by row crop dusting. All right, does that make sense? The procedure. That's the procedure. Does that make sense? All right? Okay, so now we're ready to go to number 6, which is now you're ready to consult commentaries. Now, if you've needed to look something up in a commentary before this, that's okay. But now you're ready to start reading all the commentaries you have time to read. Remember, there are 3 kinds of commentaries. Exegetical, that means those that deal with the original languages and have the original language in the text, have the Greek or the Hebrew. If you've not studied Greek or Hebrew, those commentaries are less useful for you. Then number 2, expository. Those are the bread and butter. Majority commentaries fall in that category. They basically tell you verse by verse, here's what this means. Then there's a 3rd category called devotional. These are commentaries that do some exposition, but they're very applicational. They warm your heart. They tell you how to put this into practice. I believe in using all 3 of those and working through all 3 of those, as many as I have time to work through, before I write my sermon. But basically, this is the commentary step. This is where you go hog wild in your commentaries. Whoever your favorites are, Warren Wiersbe or whoever you like to read, this is the commentary phase. Step number 6, consult commentaries. All right? Pause for questions. We've done 6, got 6 to go. I got to finish these in about 15 minutes. Pause for questions, quick. Anybody? Anybody got a question? Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Here's how to cover your bases. When you're in a situation like that, where it's very debated, like Hebrews 6, 1 through 4. That's a good, all right. What I would do is briefly give all 4 views. And then say, as best I can study this, here's what I think this means. Now, you don't want to do that for every little thing, but for the biggies where there's a lot of debate, I just give all 4 views. Yeah. And then I say, now I believe this is what I think makes the most sense in context. That's how you cover the bases. Nobody can fault you if you do that. Yeah. Right. All right, consulting commentary. Everybody clear? Let's go to step number 7. This is another one that people often don't think about. Do comparative translation work. There are many translations out there now on the market, and one of the things you're trying to do in your preaching is not to be boring and not to repeat the same phrase or word over and over and over and over and over again. So your sermon here is run with endurance the race, or the text is about that. And so 28 times, let us run with endurance. Let us run with endurance. With endurance, let us run the race. No, why don't we find some ways of saying that say the same thing differently? And the way to help you do that is compare other translations. And also compare paraphrases. Not only look at other translations, but look at Eugene Peterson's paraphrase, The Message. I do that when I'm preaching. After I do all the grunt work, then I look at other translations and paraphrases. Now, why would I look at paraphrases? Because I want to find ways to say the same thing in a different way. So, the psalmist in Psalm 1 says, "Blessed is the man who doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stand in the way of sinners, nor sit in the seat of the scoffers." Well, I don't want to just I'm going to explain the meaning of those phrases in my sermon, in my exposition, right? But I don't want to just keep repeating those same phrases. I want variety, because I know that variety is important in communication. And so I may want to look at how do other translators translate those phrases. What are some other ways of saying it? And I might want to look at how does Peterson in the Message paraphrase, how does he say it? So I look up Peterson, and Peterson says, "Happy is the guy who doesn't hang out at Sin's saloon and who doesn't slink down dead-end road and who doesn't hang out at Smart Mouth College or who doesn't attend Smart Mouth College." Now, let me ask you a question. Do those colloquial statements add to the ability to communicate what the author of Hebrews is saying, or what Psalm 1 is saying when he says, don't walk in the path of sinners, don't stand or sit in the seat of the scoffers? Yes or no? Yes, it does. That's why this step is important. Because you want to learn how to create variety in your sermon. Let me give you a little statement here. High predictability leads to low impact. Low predictability leads to high impact. Now, this is a principle of communication. If you are predictable in your preaching, then the impact of your preaching is reduced. If your people know what you're going to do, you've fallen into a rut. You're always going to begin your sermon with a sports illustration. They know it's coming. You always are going to have 3 points in your sermon. They know you're going to have 3 points. You're always going to alliterate those 3 points. The people of prayer, the purpose of prayer, and the power of prayer. So your teenagers are sitting out there. Once you give your first P, they're sitting out there taking bets among one another what your next P is going to be. Now, you think that's not true. I preach in lots of churches, and I'm telling you, they tell me that's what they do. So the people of prayer, what's his next P going to be? And they're not paying attention. They're texting, each other. I'll bet it'll be purpose. I bet it'll be power. Now, you think I'm crazy, but I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. I'm telling you, high predictability leads to low impact. Learn how to vary your sermons. That'll make a big difference in your preaching. So we're going to do comparative translation where we're going to find different ways to say the same thing. Number 8. Now we're ready to say, okay, what's the central idea? What's the main point of my text? Now let me just ask you, Hebrews 12, 1 and 2, what's the main point? What's the main point? What? No, yeah, what's the main point of Hebrews 12, 1 and 2? Running the race with endurance is the main point. Everything else is secondary. Everything else modifies. He's already structurally told you that, the author. He tells you, here's what to do. Run the race of the Christian life with endurance. Now, what is he going to tell you to do? How to do that? Number 1, be aware of the cloud of witnesses gone before you. Number 2, you got to lay aside weights and sins so you can run. Number 3, you got to keep your eyes on Jesus, who's the goal, if you're going to run, if you're going to endure. And by the way, here's some more about Jesus, the author says. So now you're ready to say, okay, what's the central idea of my text? Now my sermon has to drive that home to the people. Why that? Because that's what the text says. You say, well, I want to make the central idea keeping my eyes on Jesus. All right, let me ask you a question. Is keeping your eyes on Jesus important? Yes or no? Is that important? Yeah. Is that the central idea of this text? No, it's not. The central idea of this text is run the race with endurance, because the author has encoded that in the only imperative in the text. Now he's going to tell you 3 things you need to do to successfully do that, and one of the 3 things is what? Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. But is your sermon all about keeping your eyes fixed on Jesus? Is that what the sermon is about? No. Do you follow what I'm saying here? You see, if everything has the same level of importance, then nothing is important. But that's not how people talk, and that's not how texts are written. See, our text has one main point encoded in an imperative. Run with endurance the race set before you. Everything else in the text is subordinate to that and tells you how to do it. Are you with me? Y'all follow what I'm saying? Now, I want to make sure we're clear that Dr. Allen is not a heretic. Is keeping your eyes on Jesus in this text important, yes or no? Yes. Is keeping your eyes on Jesus the main point of this text? No, thank you very much. Yes, sir. Right. Right. It becomes the third of three foci of doing that. Right. Because you see, you got two prior to that. You don't want to make the third one more important than the other two because they are all three encoded in parallel phrases. Parallel clauses. Right. I would say that's right. You go from the cloud of witnesses to yourself to Jesus. Yeah, sure. No problem with bringing all of that out, but you don't write a sermon with the sermon title, Keep Your Eyes on Jesus. You just miss the focus of the text. The focus of the text is encoded in the imperative. Now, see, what happens here is we want to think, well, Jesus is everything, and He is, but that anything that's said about Jesus in the text, that's got to become the most important point. That's where we make a mistake. No, authors have ways of encoding mainline information versus subordinate information. And in this text, the main point is not keeping your eyes on Jesus. That's a subpoint. It's necessary to fulfill the main point, and therefore it's important. And when you preach it, you're going to make that the point. But what you're not going to do, what you shouldn't do, is create a sermon on keeping your eyes on Jesus, and then you create subpoints. Peter didn't keep his eyes on it, so he got in trouble. Joseph, or not Joseph, because he did. And so now you're picking and pulling from other places in the New Testament. You've just converted a text into a topical sermon. Right. Yeah, the imperative, anytime you have, this is a linguistic principle, anytime you have an imperative in a paragraph, it becomes automatically the most dominant information the author is communicating. That's a linguistic definition. Well, no, the imperative is run the race with endurance. Right. The imperative is basically don't quit. Well, because it's in the imperative mood. It's an imperative. Yeah. Right, correct. Yeah, in Greek, it's an imperative, and by definition, everything else is subordinate to it. Remember, we looked at it on the, yeah. That's where you depend on commentaries to help you see that. Right. You bet. No, I understand. No, I understand fully. Yeah. Yeah, that's the only complete sentence. Everything else is a dependent clause. By definition, a dependent clause never conveys the most dominant information in a text. That's how you know. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Right. Correct. It goes back to that step. And in our text, there's only one independent clause. Everything else is dependent by grammatical definition. Therefore, that's how you determine what's the main point versus what are the subpoints. That's all I'm saying. All right, now, wow, we're already over time. Just give me 5 minutes. We'll end at noon, and we'll still have an hour to eat. That'll be plenty. Okay, so now let me give you the last three. Keep going here, or the last four. Now you're ready to develop the sermon outline. You're now ready to outline your sermon. You've done all the work, preparation to this. So now you're ready. You've got the main idea. All right, so now you're ready to outline. Now, remember what was on that screen, that block diagram. In that block diagram, how many main points are there in this text? How many subpoints are there? How many subpoints are there? One. One main point, 3 subpoints, 1 subpoint. All right, here they are. We go through them again. Main point, run with endurance the race set before you. That's the main point. Oh, okay, there it is. He put it back on the screen. There are 3 subpoints, all encoded in participles, subordinate clauses. Having a cloud of witnesses, laying aside, and looking. Those 3 tell you how to do the command. And then there's a subpoint, why you look to Jesus. Why not your pastor? Why not your father or mother or your best friend or your Sunday school teacher? No, you keep your eyes on Jesus because of who he is and what he has done. Everybody see that? Yes, sir. Okay. Right. Okay, now here, again, I don't have time to go into this. You and I were taught that if you have 1 subpoint, you have to have 2. Okay? That's true for outlining in English. It's not true for structuring a sermon. If the text has 1 subpoint, that's all you should have in your sermon. Now, here's the bottom line of what I've been driving at since yesterday. All right, here I'm going to step down here to say this. Whatever the text says, that's what you do. If the text has 1 main point, you don't write a sermon that has 3. If the text has 2 main points, you don't write a sermon that has 1 main point. You follow the text, period, because the text is king. Now, this is what expository preaching was originally. But nowadays, it's been stretched into infinity. So that a lot of what pastors do a lot of times is they do part of the text, they follow part of the text, and then they insert stuff that's not in the text, or they make something that's subordinate in the text, they make it the main thing. That's not true expository preaching. The text is king. So the structure of the text becomes the structure of your sermon. So in the sermon on this text for next Sunday, your outlining of this text, what is your outline? How many main points? How many subpoints? How many subpoints? That was true of this text 500 years ago, and it will be true of this text 500 years from now in terms of structure. Now, application or illustrations, wide variety of how to do that. But in terms of structure and meaning, there it is. Because that's what the Greek says it is. You can't monkey with that. Well, you can if you want to mispreach it. Y'all with me on this? You see what I'm driving at? Okay. So, there's your structure. So write out develop your sermon outline. 10, 11, and 12 real quick. Number 10 is write out your sermon body. Now you're ready to write the sermon to whatever level you write it. Some of you may do full manuscript. You may write out every word. I don't. I've done that on a few sermons. Mostly I don't do that. I write out extensive notes, usually about 4 pages. And you just do that however you do it. But here's where you're writing the body of your sermon. And you're going to do 3 things in the body of your sermon. You're going to explain, you're going to illustrate, and you're going to apply. Here's what it means. Here's a way of illustrating what it means. Here's the application. Right? All right. Write the sermon body. Number 11. Write the conclusion. You've written the sermon body. Now you can write your conclusion. You know what you've said. Now you can figure out how you want to conclude it. And there's a handout on the conclusions, how to write a good one. We won't go over that. Number 12 is write out the introduction. Now, why is this number last? Why is the introduction last? Right. How can you write an introduction if you haven't written what you're going to introduce? So now you're ready to go to writing the introduction. There's a handout on that you have. And these are the 12 steps of sermon preparation. Now let me just say this in closing. It's not a song until it's sung. And it's not a bell until it's rung. And it's not a sermon until it's preached. So Monday through Saturday, it may look really good on paper. But Sunday morning, you've got to stand up and deliver it. And therefore, the second level of what's crucial in good preaching comes into play. Content, that's what we've been talking about the whole time. But there's a whole nother level that you must work on, delivery. And there are many keys to good sermon delivery, one of which is eye contact. And the more notes that you use in your preaching, the less you will have good eye contact with your people. Work to reducing your notes. For example, can any of you say in here that in this session, this session that I've led today, this session, I have not looked at you personally at least 20 times? Can you say, raise your hand, if you don't think I've looked at you at least 20 times? Raise your hand. Notice that no hands are up. That would be because if you raised your hand, you would be a liar. Because I have made a point to make eye contact with every person in this room 20 or more times in my delivery. Because these are things this is what I do. It's what I teach. This is how I eat, sleep, live, and breathe this stuff. And I know that good communication depends on eye contact. And so I've made a point to look at each individual in this room. Now, you get a larger congregation, you can't look at each individual. But what can you do? You divide up the building in sections, and you look at the group over here and preach to them for a little bit. Then you look at this group here. And if you're looking in the middle of this group, everybody in this group thinks you're looking at them. Same here and same here. Divide up your building into quadrants and give equal eye contact time to each quadrant. Okay, enough of all that. I pray this has been helpful to you. These are 12 steps. If you'll apply them, I promise you they'll work. I've taught these steps to thousands of pastors and students. Thousands in 12 different countries as well. This is the methodology of sermon prep I've used for 35 years personally. I know that it works. Now you say, well, that's fine, dandy, and wonderful, but I kind of like my own method. No problem. Like the lady that kissed the cow, everybody to their own taste. You just go right ahead. Do what you want to do. If it works for you, great. No problem at all. So I hope this has been helpful. One last question. Yes, sir. Well, when I do get feedback, it's almost always positive. When I go through this, if I'm in a 2-day conference and we're going through that step number 5, and there are 12 sub-steps where you get into the Greek, and, then I have people who say, hey, Dr. Allen, you lost me. I can't do that, So I don't teach it. My students have already had Greek, so I teach them how to do this from the Greek New Testament. But I know that the majority of pastors have either forgotten their Greek that they had, or they never had it. And so I don't even look at Greek. I just take what I know is true of the Greek text, and then I teach the passage directly in English. But the feedback I get is positive. I know of people all over the place that use this simple methodology, 12 steps to write a sermon every week. The Logos, the Bible program, Logos, they have a section in there called David Allen's 12-step, and then they show you what to connect in their digital base, where to go to do word studies, where to go to do comparative translations. They've got a workflow chart from first to end called David Allen's Method of Sermon Prep. I usually get really good response and feedback. People say that makes sense, it covers all the bases, and it keeps me biblical.